Okay, first of all, welcome to everyone. I want a special thanks to Diane Wright for putting this on. I know you were roped into it by my sister. And I'd like to recognize Mike Sardella. Thanks, Mike, for coming. It's good seeing you again. And I'd asked him to please withhold any corrections till after I'm done. But I also like to thank my sister Vicki for roping me into this. And I told her, I told a couple of Miller Sardella stories, and all of a sudden she thinks I'm an expert. So she says, "Hey, let's have a big gathering." And all of a sudden it got, the steamrolled here into what we have right as you see in front of us. So hopefully, I felt obligated today to do a little research to back up some of my preconceived ideas. So hopefully, unfortunately, I'm not really familiar with that, so I'll have to refer to my notes periodically here. I'm not a historian. I don't have a great memory, so I'll do my best to try to recall it as we go. I'll focus primarily on this what I call Tuolumne County folklore, which is at least based somewhat on fact, but has been embellished by repeating these stories over and over again, as Mike and I have heard them repeated. So hopefully today you'll get a feel for some of the culture and the climate that was the Tuolumne County of the late 50s and into the 60s. And most of us here were alive during that time, and have experienced that, and hopefully it'll bring back some great memories for you. It did for me both when I was telling these stories over the years, as well as the research I just did in the last couple of days. Now, the stories that I'm going to talk about center on Miller Sardella and the Sardellas. So I'm going to spend a little time with some background information. I don't know, many of you aren't familiar with them, so I'll give you some background information on the history of the Sardellas. So you kind of give it a flavor for what constituted Miller Sardella, his personality, and how he was kind of sort of a central figure, if you will, in many of the stories that we'll talk about. Well, so for the background, Giovanni and his wife, Maria Sardella, came here from Italy. Giovanni followed his brother Joe, who came to the county ahead of him, and in 1910 he followed by himself, secured a job down here at the lime kiln, which is just south of Sonora, and worked there for about 2 years before he called for his family. Now, Maria, when he left, was pregnant with Emilio, which we now know as Miller Sardella, and he had two sisters and an older brother who were also alive. So she came with babes in arms 2 years later with Miller and his brother, Ernest, that we call Curly. Remember, Curly, who became a great philosopher in Tuolumne County in his later years. Yeah, one of my favorite quotes from Curly is that when a lot of his friends started to die, and so many of his associates, he was quoted in the paper as saying, "People are dying nowadays that never died before." Yeah. So Curly, he took up shop right outside Safeway. Had a little bench out there. Had his dog that he had with him, and used to, took every opportunity to talk to people coming in and out of Safeway and impart his wisdom. So Curly was the oldest of the Sardella boys. So when they got here, the family was 4. They lived out Sanguinetti Ranch, right across from Perco's there. You know where that is? Now they stayed at Sanguinetti Ranch, and Giovanni worked in the lime kiln, earned money, and got enough money to buy the ranch that's just down the hill on the right-hand side from the lime kiln, just up the hill from Sullivan's Creek and on the right. And he bought that ranch right in there, and he moved his family there. And at Sanguinetti's ranch and there, they had 5 more children. So they ended up with 5 boys and 4 girls. okay, in the family, 9 members. And the boys, all were pretty, had great reputations here in the county, but of course, the one that most of the legacy and the stories are about were Miller, primarily for his duties as sheriff and deputy sheriff on the Tuolumne County Sheriff Department, but also for his unique personality, which we'll talk about throughout this particular presentation. Well, all the men actually worked at the lime kiln, so they all got jobs there. It's pretty rough work for those that didn't know, but mostly manual labor, very hot. They're sweating and difficult. So actually, the 3 eldest brothers, Curly, Reno was and Miller. Reno was the 3rd brother. The 3 eldest brothers sort of branched out into horse breaking and working with cattle. So they kind of separated from the ranch, from the lime kiln duties to ranch work, and became packers up in the high country, as well as breaking horses and working as cowboys. So again, Miller is the legend among them and is popular based upon his tenure as Tuolumne County Sheriff. And a lot of the stories, we'll talk a little bit about Reno and Miller throughout when some of the stories that I'll tell you. They were quoted in the paper. One of his sisters were quoted in the paper. Mary was quoted as saying that they had twin passions, and that was raising horses and raising hell. Because the 3 elder Sardella boys were always living life on the edge back in those days, as far as their activities, and they all were they called them show-offs because they would break the horses down. They had all kinds of young ladies would go down and watch them. They're always in love with the cowboys. And of course, Miller, if you ever saw him in action, never missed an opportunity to take his hat off and talk to a pretty young girl. It didn't matter who they were, where they were. And I never saw him talk to a woman with his hat on. He always took it off. So he was always a gentleman, and he was always having had cowboy attire, and he always seemed to charm them. Also, Reno, Miller, and Curly also worked for all the cowboy movies that were shot up here. So Reno in particular provided all the horses, the cattle, the chickens, the pigs, whatever they needed. He collected it and gave it to the movie sets that for whatever scene they were shooting. And all 3 of them became stuntmen and working for these movies, and they got $10 a fall, they used to call it. So, and in many cases, had ended up with broken bones to show for it. But again, it sort of added to their legacy as cowboys. Miller also would come up scraped up and beaten up because not only did he break horses, but he was also an accomplished boxer. People don't realize this. He's a fairly small individual, but he boxed for money in the basement of of downtown theater. The Bank of America is right now. It's a basement. And he had boxed for $5 a round, of course. And being small, he was still held his own. One of his sisters says he was very quick, very fast, and very quick hands. So he was a good boxer and earned a little bit of extra money doing that, but ended up getting a few bruises and broken noses, etc. Now, it's interesting, I think, to note that of the 9 children and their direct descendants, in 1974, the article that I read, the 33 descendants, all but 1 stayed here in Tuolumne County. So I don't know what the numbers is now, Mike, you might know, but it's interesting to note that they stayed locally and all sought professions, got married to local individuals, and had families of their own here within the county. The first story I want to talk about Miller was how Miller entered the military. Now, I also found, in my research, I found their engagement announcement to Mary Patterson, was in there, and his claim to fame, Miller's claim to fame. They had some bunch of stuff on Mary in there, but Miller's claim to fame was he was the most renowned and best bronc rider ever to be produced by Tuolumne County. Anyway, so and how he got in the service is related to that, because he was cowboying one of the rodeos, and then the horse ended up rolling on him, and he ended up breaking and hurting his leg very, very, very badly. And he was on crutches for a long time. So he was, if you remember, if you saw Miller downtown, he'd always like to squat really down with his heels up in the air, low squat, and he would talk to people as they passed by in that low squat downtown. It's really kind of a strange squat that he had there with his knees out and squatting down. He was very comfortable. Anyway, so he was downtown, and of course now he can't squat because he got a broken leg, so he sits down in front of the drugstore downtown, puts his crutches against the wall, and he's there talking to people as they come by. And so he takes off his hat to wipe his brow, and someone's entering the drugstore and they throw some change in his hat. So he thinks this is funny, Miller, he thinks this is great. So Miller keeps his hat out there. People come by, some of the people know him, thinks it's a joke, and throw some money. Other people don't know him, that coming in there, throwing money, and tourists that are, going in the drugstore and stuff, throwing money in his hat. And anyway, the word gets up to Mary, who at that point in time was the secretary of the draft board for Tuolumne County. So Mary goes down and sees him, and she gets madder than hell. So she goes back up to the board, takes the draft list, and puts Miller's number 1. He's not even on the draft list. He's not a naturalized citizen. So he puts him on the draft list. Of course, he gets drafted. He goes in the military, and gets assigned for training up at Fort Lewis. No, not in Seattle, up in Washington. And because the war's starting, and so he goes up there, and they find out that he is not a citizen. And of course, now Italy has entered the war on the Axis side, so he's still a resident of Italy, and he's in the military. So they arrest him, and unfortunately, they don't tell his commander, his colonel, that they just arrest him right there when they process him, find out he's an alien, he's not a citizen, and he's Italian. So the colonel who met all the soldiers is driving by with all the POWs that are being marched. He recognizes Miller, and he says, "Stop the vehicle!" And he yells at the sergeant marching the POWs, says, "Stop your formation!" So he stops the formation. He goes over to Miller and goes, "What are you doing here?" And Miller says, "Well, I'm not a citizen. They arrested me." So he said, "Okay, I'll make some phone calls." So the colonel makes a couple phone calls. About a couple days later, he gets returned to his unit, and he eventually secures his citizenship. I read an article that he was again injured in training, and injured his leg, and ended up being reassigned as a military policeman in Missouri in charge of POWs from the Second World War. So, and that's where he acquired, if you will, police training and the credentials, if you will, when he returned to Tuolumne County to apply for a position in the sheriff department. So he came back, he applied for a position as a deputy sheriff, and they were at that point in time increasing the sheriff department by 25%. So it was just fortuitous. Now, there was only 3 people in the department. That means they hired 1 person. So they hired Miller. And there's a few stories I'll tell about Miller and his initial time there in the sheriff department. One of his first duties, Well, he spent around 16 years as deputy sheriff, and I'll go a little bit of that. And then the then sheriff was being recalled in a recall election. I never did find out what the purpose of the recall was for that sheriff. So they had an election. Miller had spent 16 years on the force already, so he ran in 1962 for that in that recall election and was elected as sheriff. And then a few months, I think it's 6 or 8 months later, they had the regular election. He ran for that, and he was elected for the first time and 2 subsequent times after that, for a total of 13 years or so, more or less, as sheriff. So that was a pretty long tenure for a sheriff here in Tuolumne County. Not like Dan Backer. I think Dan Backer had the record of like 26 years or something, right, or 28 years. One of the Dan Backers is way before Miller. One of the first duties that he had as sheriff was to form a search and rescue team to rescue those folks that got lost or misoriented up in the high country. And he would either find them or recover their bodies, mostly recovered their bodies. He became famous. Both him and Reno worked together as a team. Each had their own group of search team that went out and to find them. And it was a sort of an informal competition between them to see who could find the lost soul up there in the high country. So there's several good stories on that, and Mike, you might be able to fill it in on there. But my favorite is that there was a news reporter that was going to go with Miller on one of these search and rescue teams, and so Miller went up. Miller knew the backcountry because he had helped pack in, and so did Reno. So they would find out where the individual was headed, and they knew kind of where the wrong turns were. Then they would figure out where he might have made the mistakes, where he went, and they would divide up what the plan was to go find where these missing people were, and then they would go the different directions and different solutions, and they'd try to run them down. Well, Miller had the reporter with him, so Miller goes out and they stop and they make camp, and then he goes out on his own, finds this guy, he's dead, so he takes him and props him up in a tree, next to a tree, sitting up, and he goes back, talks about the reporter and says, kind of, just follow my nose. I think he's this way. So he takes them on this circuitous route to this tree, finds this guy dead. And all of a sudden he's a genius with this newspaper man. Gets written up in the paper, gets carried on national news, becomes the hero of Tuolumne County. So, they were, both the brothers were, had competition as to who was going to find the missing soul. So when they would find them, a lot of times they'd, send somebody on their team back with the body. And when they meet up with them, because they had coordinated where they would meet after they searched these certain areas they divide up, they wouldn't tell the other one that they found the guy, and they'd send him off on the next leg of the circuitous thing, and then they would go back with back to the pack station and laugh their butts off because the other one was out searching for a dead body or another person they'd already recovered. Anyway, they really played practical jokes on each other, and Miller he loved practical jokes, and he loved pulling your legs, and he loved telling you yarns and stories. And one of the things that you'll read about is whenever he says, "This is the truth I'm telling you," whenever he said that, you're getting some spin yarn. So this is the truth I'm telling you. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Miller as the sheriff and as a deputy sheriff, because he had a very unique personality. And you had Carlo De Ferrari talks about when he first assumed his role as the deputy sheriff, and he tells us a couple of stories about him showing up for the first day. And they came to, I think Carlo came to work 3 months before Miller did for the county. So, and they stayed together working for the county for many, almost over 30 years. So it was an interesting time. And Carlo could, he would keep track of some of the Miller's antics. So Miller shows up to start in cowboy attire, ripped shirt, blue jeans, and cowboy boots. And then the deputy sheriff, whose name I have here someplace, Walter Hoskins, who was, he wasn't sheriff, he was deputy sheriff, but he sort of ran everything for the little 4-man team that they had, So, span of control. So Walter sees Miller, sends him right home. Says, "Go home and change." Says, "You don't come to work in the sheriff department looking like that. Get a haircut, take a shave, get your get clothes on. They don't have holes in them, and come here and looking respectable." And Miller said, after that day that Hoskins made me all over. Changed the entire persona and at least what he looked at. So Hoskins is giving an in-briefing about how to do paperwork and how to serve papers and every time, and Miller, he gets about 3 or 4 sentences and Miller interrupts him and says, "Well, why do I have to do it that way?" And Hoskins would be patient, try to explain to him. And finally he says it like one time too many, and he says, "Well, why do I have to do it that way?" And Hoskins goes, "Because I said you do," and knocks him right to the ground, slugs him. Yeah, when Miller told Carlo Di Ferrari this story, he says, "You know what? It didn't bother me. I had to have to chuckle about it this day because I could see I was kind of getting on his nerves." And I just kept pushing, So Carl also tells a story when he was deputy sheriff that he was taken. He would never. First of all, he prided himself on being an outlaw himself. So it was like outlaw turns lawman, and so he had this idea that, and this my dad told me, he had this idea that if you give trust to people, that they will repay you with trustworthy behavior. And so he would trust people. And one day he's taken like this dangerous criminal up the stairs of the courthouse to see the grand jury, and he's not in handcuffs. And he stops to talk, and he had the gift of gab. For those that knew him, he would stop and talk to anybody. So he stops to talk to Carlo, and Carlo's there and watching this criminal that's over there that he knows about. The name's not in the story, but Carlo's watching and listening to Miller, and he's going on and on and on. And finally, the prisoner's getting kind of impatient. So finally, he says, "Miller, are you going to go in with me or not?" He's going to turn himself in to the grand jury. Just don't let me listen to the damn stories anymore. So anyway, Carlos says Miller stopped the story and took him in. He said normally, he would take him almost anywhere without handcuffs on. And he said he only had one time where the guy broke and ran. He said Miller chased him down by just past the Sportsman and tackled him, and kept at him. And even after that, he still wouldn't handcuff him if he could. He many times, there were different. Those were different times, and Miller made a point of meeting just everyone in the community. He tried to get face to face with everyone, introduce himself. When someone else new moved in, he went up and introduced himself and got to know them, knew their names, knew where they lived, knew how many children they were, what their ages were. He did his very best to get to know the people of the county. And that served him big dividends when he actually ran for sheriff. He generally trounced whoever was running against him, getting 3-1 votes in most of the elections over his competition. So he would get a warrant to arrest somebody. he wouldn't go to their house if he could. He'd just call them on the phone, ask them to come down and come in, and they did. Because, where are they going to go? Miller knows everybody in the county, and what are they going to do? Not come in? So it's not like you're anonymous or something like they are nowadays. You're not going to escape anywhere. It's where you're going to go. Miller will, So they would, most of the time, he called them up, they would come in. When he couldn't get a hold of them, he went out to serve the papers, and most of the time he'd call them out of the house so the family wouldn't see it. And he said, "Hey, this is what it is. Why don't you go inside, do and come back out, and I'll take you to jail." And the trouble is, if sometimes they just open the door and invite him in, and when he went in, if he went into his house, he would delay taking him to jail. He wouldn't, if he was seen by the family or whatever, he would just, I'll get with him later and serve the papers later. And it was that kind of respect that he had for people, regardless of being accused of whatever, that sort of came across with everyone that he dealt with on a professional basis. And it's a luxury that we probably don't have nowadays. And another thing he did, he used to stop drunks in cars and just take them home, leave the car there on the road and say, "Hey, walk back tomorrow, catch a ride, somebody." But he would just take them home, and so they wouldn't, damage their records, especially with kids and stuff. In fact, I was a benefit of one of those. He did his best, Miller did, to make sure that he didn't build a record, that he treated everybody with respect. And my dad said that he wasn't trying to be benevolent. He said that Miller just hated doing paperwork. And that was the underlying motivation. Several times, I read someplace there was 3 times that he was injured arresting a criminal. And one time he was shot in the stomach by a young kid. And all 3 times he never pressed charges against the individual. And all 3 times he never pressed charges. I guess he figured he just caught him on a bad day or something. But it just goes to show you what kind of respect that he had for the records and sensitivity to the records. Nowadays you get a record and you can't go in the military. Used to be they gave you a choice, either go to jail or go to the military. Okay, now I want to talk the story about how Michael Patrick Rattlesnake Sardella ended up getting the rattlesnake name. Now, you still have that, Mike, as part of your official name, or?
No, actually the middle name's Patterson. My mom. There's very few people, but there's still a few people that call me Rattlesnake. Most of them are all still.
Is it on your birth certificate?
No.
Really? Because that's what.
The priest didn't want to put it.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'll amend my story here. It kind of makes it not as good, though.
Just go with the love.
Okay, so Mary's pregnant with Mike, and she's due anytime, right? So Miller's got a duty. I think maybe she was going to minor labor pains. She was in labor pains. So Miller, having never missed a shift, goes to duty. Okay, goes on shift duty. He gets the call. I mean, it takes a while to have labor, right, to have a baby. So, so he goes on shift, and he gets a call from Fred Musi, who says that he's been shot at from the jungle. Now, for those of you who don't know where Hales and Simon is now, just down the hill from there on the left-hand side, there's a bunch of shanties in there. They used to call that the jungle. And the king of the jungle was a guy named Rattlesnake John. So he goes down to the jungle. There's just a couple, shanty buildings down there. And he hears some yelling. So he goes in, walks in the door, and here's Rattlesnake John with his gun pointed at Fred Musi. And Fred is trying to talk him out of shooting him. So Miller walks in on it, and Miller says, "Hey, stop what you're doing. Fred Musi is a deputy sheriff of mine," which probably was, because that's another way that he got votes, was to deputize half the county. Make it a loyalty factor here, There was no limit on deputies at that time because they were unpaid. So Miller starts trying to talk Rattlesnake John out of shooting Fred. Fred just lived like 3 doors down from us, by the way, coincidentally, in Sonora from my mother. So the Rattlesnake John gets pissed and just swings the gun on Miller. Miller dies for cover the same time he shoots, and just barely misses Miller. And then he turns his gun back on, thinking that he might have shot him based upon him falling, and turns his gun back on Fred and is about ready to plug him. And Miller crawls out the door, comes around the back of the shanty, comes in the back door, grabs him from behind, wrestles him to the ground, arrests him, takes him to jail. Well, he's en route to jail, and he gets word that he's now a proud father of Michael. So he goes to the hospital. He sees Mary there, and so he's got this great idea that he wants to name Michael actually Rattlesnake Sardella, after Rattlesnake John, who just tried to shoot him. So, of course, Mary's having none of this. So she argues with him. She finally convinces Miller not to name him Rattlesnake. But according to the article I read, they settled on Michael Patrick Rattlesnake Sardella. Okay, some historic Sardella quotes. All the meanest person needs is a fair deal. That was kind of his motto. So that, in other words, no matter what criminal that you arrest, always give them the fair shake. The other one, you can't be a good sheriff unless you've been an outlaw first. The grand jury called me a Model T sheriff, and with all the problems we have today, maybe we should go back to a Model T. And finally he says, everything's changed. We knew everybody. That was the main battle, see? We lost all that. And when we lose that trust in people, we lose everything.